No country has won the World Cup more often than Brazil. 5 times. For most of football history, they didn't just win, they were the team everyone else measured themselves against. And then somewhere along the way, that stopped. They haven't lifted the trophy since 2002. And in 2014, in front of their own fans, they lost a game so lopsided, it still feels strange to say out loud, 7-1. This is the story of how football's greatest nation lost its grip on the sport it used to own, and whether it's gone for good or just sleeping. To understand how far they fell, you have to remember how high they once stood. Go back to 2002. That summer, Brazil had a front three defenders genuinely feared. Ronaldo, Rivaldo, and a 22-year-old Ronaldinho, who played like the game was a joke only he was in on. 3 players, 1 yellow shirt, and a kind of football the rest of the world could only sit back and watch. They won the World Cup that year, their 5th, and honestly, it felt like it might never stop. But Brazil was always more than a team that won things. They were an idea. Other countries produced great players. Brazil produced myths. Pelé made the impossible look routine. Garrincha dribbled like the ball was tied to his laces. Romario was ice in front of goal. Ronaldo was unplayable on his day. And Ronaldinho made the whole thing look like fun. They had a name for it, Joga Bonito, the beautiful game. Football played with freedom and imagination, and it's the reason kids on every continent grew up wanting that yellow shirt. By 2002, the magic was at its peak. What nobody noticed was that it had already begun to slip. Now, if you ask most people when it all went wrong, they'll point to one night, one scoreline, the 7-1. But that game wasn't the start of Brazil's problems. It was the moment the rest of us finally saw them. Brazil didn't lose their talent that night. The truth is quieter and a lot more uncomfortable. The game had changed, and they hadn't changed with it. And the warning signs were there earlier than people remember. Back in 2006, Brazil brought maybe the most hyped attack ever assembled to a World Cup. Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Kaká, Adriano, the so-called Magic Quartet, and went out in the quarterfinals to a France side run by a 34-year-old Zidane. At the time, it looked like a bad day. Looking back, it was the first real sign that talent on its own wasn't going to be enough anymore. But the night that made it impossible to ignore came 8 years later, July 8th, 2014, a World Cup semifinal against Germany, at home. The whole country had spent a month convincing itself this was destiny. Instead, it turned into the worst night in their football history. Germany scored in the 11th minute, and then it just kept happening again and again 5-0 before the half hour was up. The cameras kept finding faces in the crowd, and people were openly crying. The players looked lost. It finished 7-1. In Brazil, they gave that night its own name, the Mineirão, after the stadium it happened in, an echo of the Maracanazo in 1950. The last time the country's football broke its own heart at home. The world called it a collapse, and it was. But it was also something harder to admit. It was honest. Because Germany didn't break Brazil that night. They just exposed what was already there. While Brazil had spent years selling the world on the brilliant individual, the one player who could win a game on his own, everyone else had quietly been building something different. Systems, structure, high pressing, sports science, data on every run and every pass. Football was turning into a team game in a way it never quite had been. It stopped being about having the best player on the pitch and started being about having the best organized 11. And nobody understood that better than Germany, who'd torn their own system down years earlier and rebuilt it from the academies up. By 2014, they weren't really a team. They were a machine. Brazil turned up with the same gift they'd always had and ran straight into the future. That's the real reason the 7-1 still matters. Not that Brazil lost. Anyone can lose a game. But how easily they came apart against a modern, organized side. And the uncomfortable part is that it wasn't only Germany. Everyone was catching up. Spain, France, England, Argentina, even smaller nations with a fraction of Brazil's talent. For decades, the world had tried to copy Brazil. Now it had worked out how to beat them. The strangest part of all this is that Brazil never stopped producing brilliant players. Neymar was, for years, one of the best on the planet. Vinícius has spent the last few seasons tormenting the best defenders in Europe. Rodrygo, Endrick, the talent just keeps coming. So if the players were never the problem, what was? In a word, identity. Brazil got caught between two versions of itself, the instinctive, beautiful football that made them famous, and the disciplined, structured game the modern sport now demands. Lean too far one way, and they lose the thing that made them Brazil. Lean too far the other, and they get left behind. And for years, nobody, not the coaches, not the federation, could work out how to be both. You could see all of it in a single image. The 2022 World Cup, a quarterfinal against Croatia. Neymar, who had just equaled Pelé's record for goals for Brazil, sitting on the pitch after a penalty shootout, in tears, while a young fan in the stands cried with him. Another quarterfinal. Another early flight home. The same story, just newer faces. But maybe that's exactly where the next chapter starts. Because this new generation feels a little different. These are players who grew up with that Brazilian flair, but who also came through European academies, training under elite coaches every week. They might not have to choose between beauty and structure the way the players before them did. They might be the first who can have both. And if they ever do work it out, if they can take all that imagination and finally give it a shape, then the most dangerous team in the history of the sport might just wake back up. Because whatever else is true, Brazil changed how the world sees this game. They made it feel alive, unpredictable, joyful. The trophies dried up, but the dream never really did. Somewhere out there right now, there's a kid knocking a ball against a wall on a dusty street, dreaming about being the next Pelé, the next Ronaldo, the next Neymar, dreaming about bringing it all back. Because football's greatest nation isn't gone. It's just trying to remember who it is.